The role of the lawyer might evolve over time, but ultimately that sort of idea of them being a kind of trusted counsellor that's giving a range of different support to clients, I find it hard to imagine a future in which, for a lot of people, that isn't still going to be a valued service.
Hi, I'm Belden Mankus. Welcome to The Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders actually are doing and what they've learned along the way.
My guest today is Ken Fowley, chairman of Stowe Family Law, the UK's largest specialist family law firm, supporting individuals and families through some of the most complex and personal moments of their lives. Ken's career spans decades of leadership across professional services and private equity-backed businesses. He brings deep expertise in governance, scaling multi-site organizations, and guiding people-centric firms through periods of strategic growth and institutional development. Ken, welcome to The Purposeful Strategist.
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you. So Stowe Family Law is one of the most prominent specialist family law firms in the UK. Could you give us a picture of the firm today? Size, geographic footprint, areas of specialism, kinds of clients, anything that'll help people get a sense of what the business is about.
Sure. So Stowe is the UK's largest family law firm. We have about 400 professionals working within the firm, about 200 of whom are family lawyers. We have full coverage of England and Wales, and we've recently entered partnerships with a firm in Scotland to extend our reach there, and we've also commenced a partnership with a practice in Australia. In the financial year ending March of 25, the last published accounts of the business, and we had a top line of about 50 million sterling. The firm has, I suppose, coverage across all of England and Wales, and as I say, we've now put our toe in the water in some other geographies.
And as far as kind of the offering, it sounds like you do some things beyond family law, but
yeah, I think most of the work that we do, I think people would see as pretty standard family law fare. So couples who are navigating divorce, helping them with financial aspects of that separation, as well as, I suppose, the legal aspects. We also do quite a lot of matters involving children and their affairs, whether that's within or beyond the scope of a married relationship. That represents probably over 90% of our work. And then the balance of our work are in related areas. So things like adoption, surrogacy, pre and postnuptial agreements, that sort of thing. But predominantly we're a business that looks after folks who are going through a breakup and the legal and other aspects that are connected to that.
And just sort of so I get a sense of it, does that take you into sort of like trust and court of protection work, or is it more really the family bits?
We have a very sort of narrow focus for our services. So we don't do, for instance, estate planning or wills or anything like that. In some contexts, that's seen as a companion to the type of work we do, but you know, our focus is in quite a narrow sphere of how people manage the breakup of a relationship.
Yeah. Private equity seems to be playing a pretty big role in the firm. I mean, how does that impact what it means to be a law firm, how a law firm works? Does it have any impact at all?
Yeah, so, I mean, the history of Stowe is that it was founded by Marilyn Stowe in 1982, and she grew the firm herself over the next sort of 15 odd years. And then Marilyn sold her interest in the business to her management team, who were at the time backed by a private equity house called Living Bridge Private Equity. Private equity has been a part of the Stowe story since 2017. Living Bridge sold their interest in the business to another private equity house in 2024 called Investcorp, who are our current partners. So actually, Stowe has been in private equity ownership for almost a decade, and it began as a means for the founder to deal with succession and move forward in her life career, and it's been a mainstay of the practice ever since. So to answer your question directly, I think that the involvement of a private equity sponsor, or now two private equity sponsors in the business, has been very positive to the business. It hasn't influenced, as it were, how we serve clients or the work we do at law firm, but it's influenced us positively in terms of how we are as a business and as an organisation. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that we would not have achieved what we've achieved over the course of the last 10 years without the support and sponsorship that we've received from our private equity supporters.
And just to understand sort of that positive impact, I can imagine some of that's, if you want to grow by acquisition, you've sort of got some of the funds to make that a bit easier. Is that true? And what are some of the other maybe less obvious positive benefits?
Yeah, so the Stowe story is not a story of acquiring other firms. So the firm has grown over the last decade through largely organic means, and that's been about being modern in terms of how we think about how we attract clients to the firm. So actually financial support in the sense of supporting the growth of the firm through inorganic means hasn't been a big part of the involvement of our sponsors. I think what private equity sponsorship has offered to Stowe is the kind of discipline and rigor and kind of intellectual challenge that you get from having folks involved in your business, intimately involved, who bring a whole range of different experiences around how, people-based businesses and how businesses that are interfacing with the sort of digital economy, how those businesses can be successful. So actually how our sponsors have supported us and the people who've sat on our board over the years been through financial means. It's been more through the intellect and the capability and the experience that they brought to our business.
And do you think you could have gotten that? Do you think a different firm maybe could get that same benefit just by having a couple of Neds on their board? Or is there something different about the fact that they're really in it with you? They have a financial interest.
I think there's probably a couple of reasons why the private equity model offers a bit more than what you might get from really well-qualified non-executive directors. I think there is a degree to which you have a shared financial interest, and, that's not to be underestimated as, I think, a factor. But I think it's more about the mindset that private equity brings. And, I think there's quite a lot of, even today, sort of misunderstandings about the role of private equity and, frankly, how private equity make their own money. Certainly in the part of the market that I'm used to and experienced in the sort of middle market. And, to be successful as a private equity investor, you need to improve and grow an asset from the asset that you acquire. And so their mindset is very much about how do we create value in this asset for all of the stakeholders, because if we make the business more valuable, then our interest in the business will be more valuable. And that's a pretty fundamental difference to, say, running a partnership, which has more of a fully distributed approach to the annual profits of the business. In a private equity investment, it's less about what we're doing in the year. It's more about what does that mean in terms of the journey that we're on and the destination we're trying to reach in terms of the value that we're looking to create for all stakeholders, including sponsor shareholders.
Yeah. Maybe you could share just a bit about your own background and how you got involved with Stowe Family Law and
Sure.
where that fits.
I'm a lawyer by training and qualification, and I've been in the legal services industry for, just on 30 years. I qualified as a lawyer in Australia in the mid-90s and worked at a law firm called Slater & Gordon, which is a, consumer-facing law firm serving clients in a range of areas, probably most particularly in the area of personal injury litigation in Australia, also in larger scale claims. And, I had a 20-plus year career at Slater & Gordon where I grew with the firm and took on more responsibility and eventually took leadership roles in Australia and eventually in the UK, which is what brought me to London. Slater's was always a very entrepreneurial firm, both in terms of how we looked to attract clients, how we looked to serve clients, the types of work that we did for clients. And ultimately, Slater's entrepreneurship saw it as the first law firm in the world to seek external capital through a public markets float. So we floated the business on the Australian Exchange in 2007, and I was a shareholder and a director of the business at that time. From 2007 until about 2016, I sat on the board of Slater & Gordon as a executive director, and I suppose through that experience, not only learned a lot about the management of law firms, but also a bit about the way in which the law firm proposition kind of interacts with capital markets, in that case, public capital markets, but the idea of what is interesting to capital markets and to investors, and how that interplays with what a law firm's trying to do.
And could you describe that interplay, or is it sort of so complex and firm specific that it's a little hard to set it out?
Yeah, the experience of working and being on the board of a business that is in public markets is you learn what makes a business attractive from an investor point of view, and you learn how to translate those lessons into the context of your business, which happens to be a law firm. So it's trying to understand how investors might be attaching certain value to things like growth or different metrics that they're thinking about in the context of their investments. And then what does that mean in the context of a law firm? And so I think that was, for me, kind of part of the learning, was just trying to translate some of the things that I was learning from my interactions with investors to what it meant to making a better business. And then in 2012, I did a sort of a 12-month MBA at the London Business School, which was an important, I suppose, pivot in my career in terms of having been a legal professional, but probably getting to a point where I was more interested in the business of law than the practice of law, although till that point, I'd been a practicing lawyer. And then from that point on, playing a role in leadership, first at Slater & Gordon, then eventually when I left Slater's, moving to Stowe Family Law. But I think it's fascinating thinking about different businesses and where you can see parallels in those businesses to, what within a law firm. And I think what public markets did was kind of shine a light on those critical things, which you could then think about in the context of your own business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when I'm sort of getting the sense it was Slater & Gordon and then kind of stepped pretty directly into Stowe Family Law. So when you made that change, what were you looking to do or create or build? What was the impact you were hoping to have?
I came into Stowe, and at that stage it had been in the hands of Living Bridge for a couple of years. So a bunch of things had already been done in terms of the business and the practice, and they were looking for someone that had my experience in sort of professional services leadership to come in and take a look at the business and offer my perspectives from the experience I'd had, as you say, scaling professional services businesses. And I suppose that's what I did over a period of sort of 6 to 12 months, was observe and try and understand the business and try and, again, take some of those learnings that I'd gained over the years about, what makes a good business and try and attach that or apply that in Stowe Family Law. And then from there, we, as a team, the board and the executive team, developed a strategy, made a few tweaks to the strategy we were then pursuing, and we sort of then pursued that strategy vigorously over the course of the next several years. So, yeah, I think originally it was really just watch and observe and think about how does this organization work, what makes it tick, and then trying to apply the experience I had to divining with the team a strategy that sort of made sense.
And just if you could take us kind of into the room where that strategy is being developed. Who's in there, who's working on it, how are you doing it? Did you use outside support? If I were to see you developing the strategy, what would I be seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so we did it within the team. We didn't use sort of external providers. I think there are a lot of good sort of strategic frameworks that you can use.
Yeah.
We actually used a framework which was introduced to us from one of the other portfolio companies of Living Bridge, a framework that they had used successfully to define their strategy. We picked up that strategy, and it's, I suppose that's one of the advantages of working within the portfolio of an investment business, is that you can be exposed to other businesses. And so, we spent some time with them and they explained the process they went through, and we largely copied that process. So we used a pretty simple framework. I think it's called Dream with a Deadline, which is a sort of a framework that we found pretty intuitive. So it wasn't overly complicated in terms of what we needed to do, but it gave us some tools that we could use. And then as a team, we just set about working out what we wanted to achieve first and foremost as a business, and then trying to understand our business and trying to understand where its strengths were and where its opportunities were, developing a pretty basic but effective plan that we could then pursue and we could assess ourselves against over time.
Mm-hmm. And has that pretty much been the strategy you've been pursuing.
Yeah, we landed that strategy just on the cusp of the pandemic at the beginning of 2020, which, obviously threw a little bit of a spanner in the works for a period of time. But, over the subsequent, I suppose, 4 years, what we call the Stowe 2.0 strategy is the strategy that we followed as a team. And it wasn't, as I say, it wasn't super complex. It was really just being clear about where we wanted to get to, identifying what we thought the important things we needed to do were in that, the levers that made the most difference, and then being honest with ourselves about how we were going relative to that plan. And again, I think that's where having external board participation and external investors is helpful, because they're not in the room developing the plan, but once the plan is determined, once they've had their input into it, they're really good at holding you accountable to it.
Yeah. If you could point to something and say that's the purpose of Stowe Family Law, what would that purpose be?
We actually think about that quite a bit, in the sense of it's an important element of our story. So, we regard ourselves as a purposeful business, and I meet every new starter in the business and have a session with them within the first several months they're with us. And I always start with our purpose. So, the purpose of Stowe is when families break down, we help them move forward. That's our why, if you like. And, we find it's important that we articulate that we remind ourselves about that, because it's ultimately the North Star against which we assess what we're doing. So it's built on an ethos around an organisation that's trying to help people, but it's trying to help people navigate through a particular life situation. So, yeah, that's our purpose.
And how do you square that off with the commercial side? Do they fit together, or do they sometimes tug at each other?
Look, I think ultimately no organisation can be successful if it doesn't maintain a balance between the interests of clients, the interests of colleagues, and the interests ultimately of shareholders or stakeholders, in the sense of those that have got a commercial interest in the business. Like, those things there has to be an equilibrium between those three things. Otherwise, I don't think your business can survive and thrive. That's not to say that there aren't moments where there's tension between those three elements, but we've always seen our objective as getting to a place where that triangle is in a reasonable degree of kind of balance, because long-term success, I don't think, can be achieved if there's an imbalance in any sort of sustained way. So, we talk about that, and both at a board and a management level, of the importance of preserving that balance between those interests, whilst recognising that that's sometimes difficult to strike that balance, and at different times there'll be different pressures on you from the different elements of it, and you've kind of just got to manage that.
And kind of curious whether you see the strategic direction from here being pretty much the same as it's been. I mean, there's those who would argue that technology and a lot of other things are changing the world of law. Some would argue it's going to completely upend it. Is the future direction the same as the past?
There is no doubt that I think technology and the impact of it on law is going to be pronounced over the next 5 to 10 years. As I said, I've worked in legal services now for 30 years. I remember when I got my first email address. I'm old enough to remember when things used to be sent by fax. I think what the technology changes that we've had up until this point have sped up processes, but haven't fundamentally changed the role that the lawyer plays or the tasks that they perform. So it may have made it a bit more efficient to provide papers to your opponents and whatnot when you could email them rather than send them by courier or whatever it might be. But ultimately, you were still doing the same things. I think what the technology we're talking about now, and the growth of things like machine learning and the power of AI, I think it does probably more fundamentally challenge the task that a lawyer, indeed many white-collar professions, perform. And so I do think that, technology will play a greater role going forward, and it will change the nature of the role of the lawyer. But I also think that the lawyer will remain central to the delivery of that service, and particularly in an area of law like ours, where, as you say, there's a very important aspect which is about emotion and about people, untangling some pretty complex interpersonal relationships. The role of the human being, I don't think, will be excluded entirely, but it may well be that the role of the human being advisor might change a bit over time. So as a business, we're conscious of that, because, as I say, our whole objective is to make sure that we're serving our clients as best we can providing a means for our colleagues to be their very best and doing that in context where we're making commercial returns. We're very conscious of making sure that our future offering is very responsive to what clients and colleagues are expecting in that sense, but doing it in a way where we can still sort of square the circle and make it worthwhile from a financial point of view. I do think technology will play an increasingly important role. I think, as is probably evident from my remarks, it's very hard to be absolutely specific about, this is what's going to happen next. And you've got to be open to the possibility. And I think hopefully if you keep very central to your mind the interests of your clients and how your business serves those clients, then that's the best way of putting yourself in the best position you can.
And sort of a little bit related to that, do you see, big shifts in what clients expect?
I certainly think that what good looks like for clients is definitely evolving. I think clients see, to be honest, the challenge of legal services, or what the reality of legal services, is that for as long as I've been involved in the profession, it's been largely a singular delivery model, which has been very lawyer focused. It's sort of like, you come to me and I will give you the advice in the time frame that I am able to give it to you, and our mode of interaction will be pretty determined by me. And that's sort of been a bit the professional relationship. I think clients are now seeing different styles of interaction with other service providers and professionals, saying, well, hang on a minute, like I'm looking for something that's a bit different to perhaps the traditional model of service that professionals have offered. And so I do think that clients are becoming more demanding in a positive way in terms of expecting the profession to meet them more in the place that they're comfortable with. But there is an expectation that the profession will meet clients more in the space and territory and in a mode that they're more familiar with. I think the second thing is clients are looking for more control, in the sense that, you've got people who are capable of doing more, whether it's through their own intellect or the tools that are available to them. And so they want a bit more influence and control over the process. And again, I think that puts pressure on providers to be responsive to that. And then things like the speed with which things are delivered, both individual initiatives, but also the total longevity of a particular matter. The cost, clearly people are very conscious of the cost of service, and that's a factor. And then I think lastly, probably the route to resolution is probably evolving a bit as well. So, if you talk to some of our lawyers who've been doing this work for a long time, they would probably say that, 10, 15 years ago, there was more conflict in the resolution of family matters than there perhaps is today, or at least the frequency with which conflict would be present. It was a more adversarial process. Today, you're finding more clients who are less interested in that and who are more interested in a path to resolution, which is less adversarial. They may well, as I say, for all of these reasons, come to the table with a more evolved view about what they want, where things sit, how far along the process they've reached with their former partner. But there's probably a different emphasis in terms of pathways to resolution than there might have been once. And, that's not universal, but I think we're probably seeing all of those factors more prominent in terms of our client interaction than perhaps would have been the case 10, 15 years ago.
And does that, you're talking about sort of different pathways and it being a bit less adversarial, or at least less frequently adversarial. Does that mean the role of the lawyer in that either changes or maybe even goes away?
I don't think that the role of the lawyer goes away, because I think at the end of the day, what people are looking for is assurance that the pathway that they've chosen and the outcome that they're settling upon is the right outcome. So people are always going to be looking for assurance that, for want of a better expression, this is a good deal. As much as they might form their own view about what a good deal is, ultimately the arbiter of that is it a good deal in the context of what they might achieve if they were to have a fully litigated outcome and decided by a judge. So whilst lawyers are able to provide a view as to what good looks like in that context, I think that they will always have that role. I think the other element is that the role that our lawyers perform is in part technical, but it's also strategic and emotional. And that role it's a multifaceted kind of responsibility. Our lawyers are not just giving people arid technical advice as to what might be in this situation. They're providing emotional support to someone who's going through a situation that they've not been through before, whereas our team go through this every day, managing different clients, and they're also giving their clients strategic and tactical advice as to how to deal with a particular situation, because obviously relationships and their breakdown are, there's a whole range of different things that are going on at any one time. So the role of the lawyer might evolve over time, but ultimately that sort of idea of them being a kind of trusted counselor that's giving a range of different support to clients, I find it hard to imagine a future in which, for a lot of people, that isn't still going to be a valued service.
I suspect this is one of these evergreen questions and probably might have been being discussed when you first started in the legal profession. But does some of that change you were talking about, shifting ways that people come to these issues and sort of their expectations, does that argue for lawyers needing a different kind of training, personality type, something else? And if so, is that actually happening, or is it just, it's always there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been the case in many professions, law included, that interpersonal skills are perhaps underestimated in the education process, but very important in the actual practice. And I think it's probably the same when you look at, the medical profession, people who have got a good bedside manner, as they say. I think that's the same in law. I mean, the truth is lawyers become reasonably specialised, reasonably quickly. And so you tend to be seeing broadly speaking, the same fact patterns through your career. Where the real skill is the skill is in the ability to make a client at ease, understand, gather information from them, communicate simply the facts. The law is like a box. You need to sort of take the facts and the emotion and everything and sort of bundle it together and put it into that box so that it's relevant to the client. And that skill it's probably less technical, although there are technical elements of it, and it's more, about your ability to build rapport. And I think that skill has always been a very important part of being a successful, whatever area of specialism you have. Maybe it's a slightly more important skill as time goes on, when some of the, technical elements perhaps are able to be, they're still going to be important. Judgment is still going to be important, but maybe some of the work about creating the sort of artifacts of law, maybe those things will be more done by technology and less by practitioners.
Turning the attention back to you a bit, I mean, clearly you've had a very rich career. How's that shaped how you've been approaching both governance and leadership at Stowe?
It is true that I'm pretty long in the tooth. I've seen some really, really good things, and I've also seen some, I've been party to some really, really bad scenarios professionally as well. So I've seen the good and the bad. I think what experience is valuable in the sense that you can hopefully recognize different patterns and understand how those things might play out. Every situation is a little bit different, but pattern recognition is not to be underestimated. I think probably the people that I work with would say that one of my strengths is my calmness and sort of levelness. I've learned through bitter experience that generally nothing is quite as good or indeed as bad as it might first appear, and that to use the expression, this too shall change. So it's one of those situations where, yes, it's important to be responsive and to be on it, but also it's important to maintain a certain degree of calmness and perspective over what's going on, because things do tend to move. I think the other thing that I probably learned over my career, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And, it's important to be responsive and in the moment and all of that, but it's also important to maintain perspective. And I often say to members of the team, yes, it's important to be thinking about what we're doing now and what we're doing next week, but it's also like, what's your sort of 3-month, 6-month, 12-month horizon? When you stand back in 3 months' time and you think, like, what have I achieved over that 3 months? Be really clear about what those goals are, because otherwise you can get very distracted in the day-to-day. The benefit of experience is just that ability to think, okay, what are actually the 3 or 4 things we really must do over the next, say, 6 months? Let's be really anchored to those, and let's not try and let the events of the day-to-day put us too far off course. And when we're assessing our progress, let's make sure we're assessing against those important milestones.
I guess the other question is, when you're thinking about Stowe, I assume you want to keep growing. I think every professional services firm needs to grow. I think it's just, when you're growing, you're happy. And when you're professional services firms, when they're not growing, they're almost always unhappy. So you've got You got pretty good national coverage, and it sounds like you wouldn't want to expand out very much the service offering. I mean, of course you could, but it sounds like part of what makes Stowe is this is the bit we do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We're pretty laser focused on trying to be really, really good at what is, I suppose, relatively narrow, but nevertheless a kind of an important life moment for people. So yeah, trying to be really, really good at that.
Yeah. So where do you see the growth coming from? Is it sort of international? You mentioned Australia. Is it we're just going to penetrate more of the market in the UK? You know, there's a few areas like Scotland where we can, there's a few things we can do, but where's the growth coming from? Yeah,
I mean, I think in terms of our priorities, even though we're the largest family law firm in the UK, we still think we're very small relative to the total market. So we think there's a big opportunity for us to serve more clients in the UK, and that's primary focus is to make sure that we continue to grow the business in the UK. And, in order to do that, we need to make sure that, being really candid about it, our proposition is more compelling to both clients and also to lawyers. That's a big part of our focus, and we assess our progress in terms of our ability to continue to grow in a market which is, it's very resilient, but it's also pretty flat in the sense that, the total number of whether it's divorces or those sort of matters tends to be very, very constant over time. Our ability to grow in that market is about our ability to effectively take share from competitors. I think you're right to say that the second opportunity for us is to see whether or not the Stowe way of working is something that would get traction in other markets. Scotland is very close by, but it's a different legal market. It's a different legal services environment. So, can we grow into that community? Can we support growth not only in Scotland, but also in Australia? And so trying to take the skills that we've developed and our way of working, our culture, and seeing that in other markets is something that's pretty exciting to us. And then I think the third priority is we spent a bit of time talking about today. It's the role that technology plays in the provision of our services going forward. And so, we're midway through a pretty substantial reboot of our technology platform. So we're partway through retiring our kind of legacy tech platform and introducing an end-to-end sort of Salesforce-based technology platform.
Interesting.
Which is a significant investment of both resources, time and human resources. And that was a decision that we made probably about a year or so ago because we thought it was important to have a bit more capability in terms of our technology, be a bit more agile than we were. But that sort of speaks, I think, a lot to where our headspace is at in terms of the role we think technology will play going forward. So that's where we're investing a lot of our bandwidth at the moment. And hopefully that then, again, opens up more opportunity for us to be more agile in terms of how we're serving clients and how we're supporting colleagues and things like that.
Yeah, no, I can see how that would make a big difference. As I'm sure you're aware, there's lots of different points of view about whether you try and do what you're doing, which is sort of create an end-to-end platform where you just accept that there's going to be best of breed and we're going to somehow have to keep swapping things out and putting new things in and gluing it all together.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, the thing that probably influenced the strategy we took technology is probably more about data. For us, being able to have all of our data in a singular location and accessible to different applications feels important.
One other thing is, again, I suspect it informed your decision about what you can do on the tech. In some of the research we've done, law firms and AI, one of the biggest things they run into is the data. We can think about all these wonderful things, but the data is not in a state to support it. You're sort of working on that in a way that I suspect is also going to give you some other benefits.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, let's hope so. I'm kind of curious if there's anything else you'd like to share with our audience, anything we haven't touched on or that you'd just like them to know.
I occupy a really privileged position and I'm really grateful for it. I think it's important in these sort of conversations to highlight that organisations like ours, businesses and other organisations, are always team efforts. And the reason that Stowe has been successful over the years is because of a great team of people who kind of pull together. And I have the fortune to be in a position to lead that group. But much more of the heavy lifting is done by them than by me. And, my job is hopefully be someone who contributes to that team effort, but it's more about sort of articulating what we're trying to do do and continuing to challenge the team to try and do better. But ultimately, it's all about the people in the organisation, and the success of Stowe is a reflection of the great people we've got working there.
Ken, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing your experience and plans and where you're headed with Stowe. Very interesting for me to hear. I think this conversation brought together the two big things law firms are talking about now, which is PE and AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, lovely to talk to you.
Thanks for joining us.
The conversation. Cheers.
Likewise. All the best.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.